The rehearsal room smelled like floor wax and old wood. Michael Jackson noticed it every time they came here. It was late afternoon in early 1969, and the room was filled with that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from repeating the same choreography for hours. The walls were plain, institutional green. There were folding chairs stacked in one corner and a piano against the far wall that nobody ever played. The Jackson brothers stood in formation, their reflection visible in the large mirror that covered one side of the room. Michael was 11 years old, small for his age. He stood slightly to the left of center, behind his brother Jermaine, whose voice had started changing and who looked more like the kind of frontman adults expected, the kind who commanded attention just by standing there. Michael didn't look like that. He was thin, quiet, the kind of kid who listened more than he spoke, who watched adults carefully to gauge their moods before deciding whether it was safe to exist. They'd been at this for 3 hours, running through "I Want You Back" over and over until the choreography was muscle memory and the harmonies were tight enough to satisfy their father, who sat in one of those folding chairs with his arms crossed, watching everything. But Joe Jackson wasn't the only adult in the room today. There were 2 men from Motown, industry professionals, the kind who decided whether kids from Gary, Indiana got to be stars or went back to being nobody. This is the true story of what happened in that rehearsal room. Not the legend of Michael Jackson, the king of pop. Not the icon who moonwalked across stages and sold 100 million albums. This is the story of a child who learned, in one overheard sentence, exactly how the world decides who matters. The moment that planted a belief so deep it would shape everything he became. The quiet dismissal that taught him being good was never going to be enough. And the afternoon, a small boy made a decision that would change music history, not by arguing or fighting, but by simply refusing to stay small. The Motown executives were talking to Joe in low voices near the door. Michael couldn't hear most of what they were saying, but he was trained to read body language. His survival had always depended on knowing what adults were thinking before they said it. One of the executives kept gesturing toward Jermaine, nodding, making approving sounds. The other one glanced at Michael once, briefly, then looked away. They ran through the song again. Michael sang his parts perfectly, hit every harmony, moved exactly when he was supposed to move, but he could feel something in the room shifting, a decision being made that didn't include his input. After the run-through ended, Joe called for a break. The brothers scattered. Jermaine went to get water. Tito sat down to retie his shoe. Jackie stretched near the mirror, and Michael, as he often did, found a spot near the wall where he could be present but unnoticed, close enough to hear but far enough away to seem invisible. The Motown executives were still talking to Joe, and this time Michael heard it. One sentence, spoken casually, matter of fact, the way adults talk about logistics when they don't think children are listening. Jermaine's the obvious lead. The younger one's good, but he's not lead material. He's too young. Michael's face didn't change. He didn't move, didn't react, but something inside him went very still. Not lead material. The words hung in the air like smoke. The executive who'd said it wasn't being cruel. He was just stating what seemed obvious. Michael was 11, small, soft-voiced. He looked like somebody's little brother, not like the center of a group. And in the music business, obvious choices usually won. It made sense to put Jermaine out front. Jermaine was taller, older, more conventionally confident. Jermaine fit what people expected a lead singer to look like. But Michael had heard something else in that sentence. He'd heard the same message he'd been hearing his whole life from his father, from teachers, from every adult who looked at him and saw something fragile. You're not enough, not yet, maybe not ever. And in that moment, sitting against the wall of a rehearsal room in Los Angeles, Michael made a decision. He didn't tell anyone about it, didn't argue, didn't cry. He just absorbed it, stored it, Let it settle into the part of him that was already learning that the world didn't give you what you deserved. It gave you what you could prove you deserved. Rehearsal continued. They ran through the set again. Michael sang his parts, danced his steps, but something had shifted inside him, something quiet and permanent. He started watching Jermaine differently, not with jealousy, with study. What was it about Jermaine that made adults see him as the lead? The way he stood, the way he moved, the way his voice carried confidence, even when he wasn't sure of the lyrics. Over the next few days, Michael started doing something he'd always done, but now with more intensity. He practiced, not just during scheduled rehearsals. All the time, in the bathroom mirror at home, walking down the street, lying in bed at night, running through choreography in his head. He studied James Brown footage until he could replicate every spin, every slide, every sudden drop to the floor. He listened to Diana Ross records and learned how she used her voice to command attention without shouting. He watched Sammy Davis Jr. performances and absorbed how a small man could own a massive stage. But more than technique, Michael learned something else. He learned that if you're going to be overlooked, you have to make yourself impossible to ignore. And the only way to do that is to be so undeniably good that people have no choice but to see you. It wasn't about confidence. Michael didn't have confidence. What he had was something more powerful. Desperation. The bone-deep understanding that if he didn't prove himself now, he might never get another chance. 2 weeks after that rehearsal room comment, the Jackson 5 had another session with Motown executives. This time it was a full run-through of their set. They were being evaluated for a showcase performance, and everything had to be perfect. The brothers lined up in their usual formation. Jermaine in the center, Michael slightly behind and to the left. They started with "I Want You Back," and for the first verse and chorus, everything went exactly as rehearsed. Then something happened that nobody expected. During the bridge, Michael stepped forward. Not dramatically, not making a show of it. He just shifted his position, planted his feet, and when his solo line came, he sang it differently than he'd ever sung it before. Louder, fuller, with a control that didn't sound like an 11-year-old trying to be heard. It sounded like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The room went quiet in a way rooms do when something unexpected happens. The kind of silence where everyone stops moving and holds their breath without realizing it. Michael held the note, extended it, let it fill the space. And when he came out of it, sliding into the next harmony, his voice had changed the entire energy of the song. It wasn't the Jackson 5 with Jermaine leading anymore. It was something else. Something built around a sound that hadn't been there before. When the song ended, nobody moved. The Motown executives looked at each other. Joe Jackson's expression was unreadable, which meant he was processing something he hadn't expected. And Michael, still standing slightly forward, could feel his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. He hadn't asked permission to do that, hadn't cleared it with anyone. He'd just done it. And now he was waiting to see if he'd made a terrible mistake. One of the executives, the same one who'd said Michael wasn't lead material 2 weeks earlier, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "Run it again." That was all he said. But the way he said it changed everything. It wasn't a command. It was a reassessment. They ran through the song again. This time, Michael didn't step back into his old position. He stayed forward, and when his parts came, he sang them with the same control, the same presence. By the third run-through, the choreography was being adjusted around him. By the end of the session, the formation had shifted. Michael was no longer behind Jermaine. He was center. Nobody made an announcement. Nobody said, "Michael's the lead now." It just happened, quietly, practically. The way decisions get made when the right choice becomes so obvious that arguing about it seems pointless. But Michael noticed. He noticed everything. The way the executives looked at him differently. the way his brothers adjusted their positions without complaint, the way his father's expression softened just slightly, the closest thing to approval Joe Jackson ever gave. But Michael also noticed something else. He noticed that the validation didn't feel the way he thought it would. He'd imagined that proving himself would bring relief, that finally being seen would quiet the voice in his head that said he wasn't enough. But it didn't. If anything, the voice got louder, because now he understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Being good wasn't enough. Being great wasn't enough. You had to be undeniable, every single time, forever. Because the moment you let up, the moment you gave people a reason to doubt you, they would. And once they doubted you, they'd replace you with someone who made them feel more certain. That's what that rehearsal room comment had taught him. Not that he wasn't talented, but that talent without proof was invisible. That potential without demonstration was worthless. That in a world that decided your value based on what they could see in 30 seconds, you didn't get to be quiet or small or uncertain. You had to command attention, not because you wanted it, because if you didn't, someone else would take the space you should have occupied, and you'd spend the rest of your life watching from the side. The Jackson 5 signed with Motown officially in March 1969. Their first single, I Want You Back, was released in October and went to number 1. Michael Jackson, age 11, became the face of the group, the lead, the center, the one everyone watched. And over the next 5 decades, he would become the biggest entertainer in the world, breaking records, redefining performance, creating a legacy that would outlive him. But people who knew him, really knew him, always said the same thing. Michael never stopped trying to prove himself, never stopped pushing, never stopped believing that one misstep, one bad performance, one moment of being less than perfect would be the moment the world stopped seeing him and looked for someone else. He worked himself to exhaustion, demanded perfection from everyone around him, became obsessive about control because control was the only thing that kept him safe from being overlooked again. And when people asked him why he pushed so hard, why he couldn't just enjoy his success, Michael would talk about excellence and artistry and giving people their money's worth. But he rarely talked about the real reason. The sentence he'd overheard when he was 11 years old in a rehearsal room in Los Angeles. The casual dismissal that had taught him the world's most important lesson. That being good wasn't protection. That being noticed wasn't guaranteed. That if you wanted to matter, you had to make yourself impossible to ignore. Not once. Every single time. The Motown executive who'd said Michael wasn't lead material never apologized. He probably didn't even remember saying it. It was just one comment among thousands he'd made about hundreds of performers over the years. But Michael remembered. He remembered the way it felt to be sitting against a wall, listening to adults decide your future like you weren't even in the room. He remembered the quiet certainty that if he didn't do something, he'd spend his whole life being someone's little brother, someone's background vocalist, someone who could have been something but never quite made it. And so he made himself into something they couldn't dismiss, couldn't overlook, couldn't reduce to not lead material. He made himself into Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the guy who sold more records than anyone in history, the performer whose name became synonymous with excellence. But underneath all of that, underneath the fame and the fortune and the accomplishments that changed music forever, there was still an 11-year-old boy sitting against a wall in a rehearsal room, hearing someone say he wasn't enough, and deciding that he would prove them wrong every single day for the rest of his life. That's who Michael Jackson really was. Not the superstar, not the icon. The child who learned too early that the world decides your value before you open your mouth. And the only way to change that decision is to be so undeniably good that they have no choice but to see you. The kid who turned a casual dismissal into a lifetime of proving that being different, being small, being underestimated wasn't a weakness. It was fuel. Some moments don't make headlines. Some rejections don't get recorded. Some sentences get spoken by adults who have no idea they're changing a child's entire life, but they matter. They echo. They plant beliefs that grow into obsessions, into careers, into legacies. And decades later, when someone asks what made Michael Jackson who he was, the answer isn't just talent. It's the memory of being told he wasn't enough, and the quiet, permanent decision to prove that everyone who ever doubted him was wrong. On a late afternoon in early 1969, in a rehearsal room in Los Angeles, an 11-year-old boy heard someone say he wasn't lead material. And instead of accepting it, instead of shrinking back into the position adults had chosen for him, he stepped forward. Not with words, with presence, with a voice that refused to stay quiet, with a decision that would echo for 50 years. That's the story they don't tell about Michael Jackson, but it's the one that explains everything.